staying personally connected with nature, even in a small sense. It doesn't mean we have to be out in the wilderness, but just staying somehow grounded in the natural environment um, helps us mentally to get beyond these facts and figures that we can communicators like me can get drowned in the 1.5s, for instance. That if you stay connected with nature and stay grounded personally, then you can reach out to other people in a more human human relatedness way, as opposed to just instead of talking at people, you start to talk with people, and you listen to them.
Welcome to Sustainability Transformations podcast, where we explore bold ideas to drive positive change for people, community, and business. And today's guest is Thomas, who is a climate communicator, a multimedia creator, the founder of Global Warming is Real, dedicated to making complex sustainability challenges accessible through storytelling. And the key goal for our conversation is to look at the climate narratives in the Anthropocene, how to speak sustainably in a world in crisis. Tom, thank you so much for joining us. Your mission is to make the incomprehensible digestible. Where did that calling come from, and how do you balance that clarity in a world where there seems to be lots of complexity in sustainability storytelling?
Well, first off, it's great to be here, and thank you for having me. And my story starts back when I was a little kid. Actually, my father was in the United States in environmental services in the federal government, and we can talk a little bit more about that later, about the federal government. But so I was always kind of brought up in a world that appreciated the environment, nature, being in nature. As I grew older, I was actually trained. I started out in music and audio engineering, but that environmental bug was always there. So about 20 plus years ago, I formed globalwarmingisreal.com. And in the process, I have learned a lot about the climate narrative. There are plenty of the science is pretty well established about climate change. I think what has failed thus far is our narrative around it, seeing as all these years later where we are in addressing climate change. My mission now is to try. It's very challenging, and we can discuss this, engaging people in a topic as, in a way, inaccessible, though it's more and more in our face, but it's also very inaccessible. The data, the science, I think there's as important as, obviously, the science is the groundings, the fundamental of how we think about climate change. But what is lacked is how we engage with people and how we get people interested in caring about climate change. So that's been my mission, and it's an ongoing mission. And I think it's founded in the idea that we're a storytelling species. We form our perceptions of reality around the stories we tell. I mean, I think in any aspect of human endeavor, we're telling ourselves a story. And so what we need to do is create a story that can engage people. That I see three basic groups of people. There's the people that you're just never going to reach. And so there's not much point in wasting too much energy with that. I've learned that the hard way. There's the people that are preaching to the choir, that you've got them. It's you want to have that community. But then there's the people in the middle that they're not like anti climate change, but they just don't know how to incorporate it in their lives, how to think about it, how to care about it. Those are the people that I am working to try to reach as my mission continues.
So, how do narratives shape our understanding? I know you said we go through stories. How do those key narratives shape the understanding of the sustainability issue, which around the climate change, biodiversity, and the energy, as opposed to the climate alarmism?
Yeah, that's a good question, because it is easy for people to do what I do to fall into the alarmism, because we see it every day. So it's easy to just sink into doomerism. You need to try to find people where they are. What I've learned is, in one of the things that I've learned the hard way again, because I was doing this, I was trying to get people to where I was. So look at this is what I know about climate change, and you've got to listen to me. And I haven't listened In the past, I didn't listen to other people or try to understand where they are in their lives. And so I think in a way, sometimes, not always, but sometimes maybe the best way I would proffer to discuss climate change is to not even invoke the word climate change, because it has become such, I would guess, certainly in the United States, but probably elsewhere as well, climate change has become a political cudgel. Just mentioning that, people run to their corners. So, what is climate change? It's the environment, it's nature, it's nature's response to what we are doing, as well as the natural cycles. I want to get that out there. Of course, climate change is a natural cycle. We're talking about anthropogenic or man-made climate change. But, talk about man-made climate change, things like that. Just talk about how this will impact people's lives. Economically, there's a concept I like to talk about. It's called solastalgia, which is um, the the feeling of loss over a lost landscape. So people's personal contact with nature and how that has changed. I think when people really think about it, especially people my age that have been around for a little while, they can see over the course of their lifetime that the climate has changed. The response of climate has changed here. And I'm in the Western United States. We have drought, we have wildfires. When I was younger, we had drought and wildfires, but not to the extent that we have them now. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that you need to try to figure out where people are, how you can find a way that they find an aspect of their lives that they care about and maybe relate how climate change impacts that. And again, not harping on climate change so much. Those words can be fraught, unfortunately. I mean, I wish we could just talk about climate change in a clear-headed, this is a problem, we have to do something about it. And there is that narrative out there. But also there's a very, especially now, it's very strong narrative that's anti-climate. In the United States, scientific papers have been, they're funded by the federal government. They have to take the word climate out of their science. So I'm not advocating that when I say don't mention climate. That's not what I mean. I mean finding another way to talk about this issue. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it makes absolute sense. It's about winning the argument in some shape or form,
Yes.
whether argument is the right term to use, but perhaps it's the next question around why do facts alone often fail to move people and what fills that gap?
Facts can be discounted. Facts can be misunderstood. Facts can be, there's paraphrasing some sort of a phrase I've heard somewhere, that you can make data say anything you want it to say. So I think using the data as a foundation, uh, again, we're a storytelling species, so we respond more to narratives than to, or there's a balance between reason and emotion. Just trying to appeal to somebody's, 1.5 degrees. To me, 1.5 means a lot. 1.5 degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels, and right there. I mean, that's a good example. If I were to try to explain that somebody that didn't really think about climate change that much, and I just said 1.5 degrees above heating above pre-industrial levels, I probably would have lost them in a way. So just relying on those numbers, and a lot of the communicators assume that other people understand what we're saying when we say like 1.5, or um, any number of ocean acidification, or these sorts of things, which are very important, and people need to understand them, but you need to come at it in another way. That maybe zero point 0.5 as an example, just say that the Earth energy balance has been shifted due to the energy, due to all the carbon that's been released in the atmosphere. Or, even that gets a little bit wonky. So that's the challenge. That is the challenge of communicating about climate, is balancing the wonky with the personal. I mean, I wish I had the magic bullet for this, and if I did, well, I'd be head the UN or something, but I don't. Nobody does. We're all fighting to find this balance, and so that's the big challenge for climate communicators.
Yeah. So you are writing Finding Home in the Anthropocene. How do you define this era in human terms?
Well, for me, the Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene has been discussed in the scientific stratigraphy as an actual era, epoch in geologic time. Hasn't quite got that far yet, but I and many others have adopted the Anthropocene as a way to communicate our era in that human impact on global Earth systems, be it the climate or land use or the oceans. So many global climate and Earth systems are impacted by human activity. So, finding home in the Anthropocene started out kind of what I was just saying. I was going to go at it with all these facts and figures. And as I work on it, it's still a work in progress, but as I'm working on it, it's becoming more of a almost a memoir of my experience growing up. I was born in 1958, so I'm a boomer, and I grew up through the 60s. And I remember because my dad was in federal environmental services, I remember his experience, and I remember the Cuyahoga River igniting in fire in the 60s, and all the progress. There has been progress in environmental issues, and then my awakening to the situation that we're in, and my it's kind of a letter to the future. I'm trying to say, look at almost apologetic. I'm sorry that we've left you this world, but also trying to figure out in my own mind how I've evolved through, when I was much younger, though I did have an environmental awareness, I really didn't think that much about it. And so I'm just trying to understand more and more how we've come to where we are, the moment that we're in, and how we might find a way into the future that is a thriving, equitable, and environmentally stable world. I don't think we're going to get there easily. I know we're not going to get there easily. It's not. We're at a point now where the choices we make, there's not going to be an easy choice. There is no silver bullet. Buying an electric vehicle is not certainly no answer. And in fact, there is no technical silver bullet, though technology has an important role to play. I think one phrase I like to use is hope is when we stop fooling ourselves. So we have to realize that we are in a very um, precarious situation. That if we go in the direction that we're currently heading, we're in for a world of hurt. But that there is hope as long as we are open-eyed about where we're at. I believe that there's hope. It's not going to be easy, but we can come out the other end of where we're at now in a much better place. I still have hope for that.
Ah, that's great. So you are developing a documentary on packaging, which is one of the
Yes.
key topics, the plastic straw,
Yes.
not necessarily a packaging example, but people are fairly familiar with the or conscious with the packaging. So, what is the broader sustainability story behind the objects that we use every day?
Well, I think it speaks to our hyper consumerism, the packaging, and I'm guilty of this. I mean, everything I'm talking about, I'm guilty. We're all, we all have our sins or whatever. Nobody. We're embedded in this economy that more and more, I'm almost exclusively is Amazon packaging based, and it makes consuming, I believe, so much more seamless. So I believe that we can find a way to think about the things that we buy. And I remember, just as an anecdote, I think I mentioned that I was trained as a musician and audio engineer. So back in the day when I was doing an audio engineering, I could go to a store if I needed to buy a mic or a mixer or whatever. I could go to a store, brick and mortar, and look at things and talk to people. Those sorts of they're gone. There's no place. That's when I was in San Francisco, and it's a major city. there's nothing available. You have to go online. There's a good online store I go to, but the small retailer has been like pushed out by these mega online retailers. And so the story of packaging is a way for us to think about how we consume products. And first off, all this packaging is not good. Even if it comes in a cardboard box, there's plastic. Like you were mentioning, plastic. Plastic is an enormously fraught issue. So, and I think that all this packaging exacerbates that. And we could talk about recycling, and I'm a little bit, I don't, do we want to get into recycling right now, or, that's another question. But so I think the story of packaging I'm working on with a filmmaker, a colleague of mine, and it's another work in progress. A lot of works in progress, but it's just a way for us to think about how we consume things. I think actually now I'm going to go on a little bit more about this. The introduction to this, I remember when I was a kid in the '60s, living outside of Denver, Colorado, and we had a milkman. He would come every, I don't know, week or so. We had a little wooden box that we'd put our empties in, and the milkman would come and put fresh milk in glass bottles in this little, it sat on our porch in this little wooden box, take the empties, and the empties I would assume would go back and get refilled with fresh milk. Things like that. That speaks to a circular kind of economy idea that we had. Now it's gone. Now if I want, milk, I go to the store and it's in a plastic bottle, probably. And then when I'm done with the milk, that plastic bottle goes into the recycling, but it's probably going to end up in landfill, unfortunately. So that is what inspired the documentary that we're working on, the story of packaging.
Yeah, that's good. Oh, we look forward to that documentary coming out. As you mentioned about recycling, from a circular economy point of view, the ideas are there about keeping materials in use as much as possible. How can we use more renewable resources rather than resources that haven't got the capability to renew over time? But where do you see the biggest blockers or challenges in achieving the optimum opportunities within a circular economy offer?
I think part of the problem is there's the recycling issue, the packaging, that's an issue. Even with the recycling, it's still built on top of a linear throughput economy. Another aspect I think is manufacturer responsibility for end of life, cradle to cradle of appliances and electronics. And let's take a washing machine, for instance. When people buy a washing machine, what do they really want? Do they really want a washing machine, or do they want clean clothes? What they want is clean clothes, I assume. And so the washing machine has a lot of parts in it that can be reused, but typically when an appliance like that gets its end of life, it's the consumer's responsibility to do something with it. I propose, and it's not just me, a lot of people have proposed that manufacturers take responsibility, that, maybe we don't own the washing machine. We don't really need to own the washing machine. We just want clean clothes. So I guess it could be analogous to leasing a car. You get the washing machine when it wears out, the manufacturer takes it back. It's their responsibility. And same thing with electronics. A problem with electronics, though, is that everybody's got to have the latest and greatest. Uh, I'm in the Apple universe, so there's another one of my sins. You know, um, they make it so difficult that if you want to change a battery, I have an iPhone 11, and it's getting to the point where it probably needs a new battery, and it's possible, but you go to the Apple store and they go, "That's an old phone. Maybe you want an iPhone 16." I go, no, just the phone works fine. It's the mentality. How fast does the phone really, how many of us actually use the full capability? Even my own iPhone, my 5 or 6 year old iPhone 11, I don't think I'm using the full capability of that phone. And I'm not a Luddite. I think of myself as kind of technically savvy, but most of this people don't even need. And you have a phone, and a year later, they're trying to sell you the next one. So I think just, we can have more. And again, it can be manufacturer responsibility. I do believe that I could give my iPhone back to Apple and I'd get a new one, which is good. Those kind of ideas will help the circular economy. But I think in the broad economic sense, we have to start thinking about how our economy now is a linear throughput. We pull resources, we use them, and we throw them away. And maybe some of that gets recycled, but most of it doesn't, especially with plastic. There's so much plastic going into just shoveling into the ocean, and it gets broken down into microplastics, and then it gets into the food chain, and it's everywhere. It's in us, it's in the air, it's in the sea, it's in the land. That would be an indication of the Anthropocene, actually, is the global impact of plastics. But anyway, I think that answers your circular economy question.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, no doubt recycling is a few steps down the line of the circular economy.
Yes.
You have the prevention, the reuse, all the way to, so yeah, you can see the data around a few countries where recycling has plateaued around 40%, plus or minus 5%. It goes to show that recycling alone isn't enough, and the prevention or the early stages of the circular economy needs to be applied. So, exploring the policy, what should listeners know about the Paris Agreement, and where do we stand post COP?
So let me back up to COP 21, where the Paris Agreement was signed. I was there. Back in 2015, 10 years ago, at COP 21 in Paris, I really had some hope that the global community was coming together to address climate change. I understood that at the time it was aspirational. Everybody understood it was aspirational. And the idea was that all the countries, I think at the time, almost all the global, everybody, except maybe North Korea or something, signed on to the Paris Agreement. Of course, now, unfortunately, the United States has pulled out. But the idea was that through INDCs, individually national determined commitments to reduce climate change, every country would contribute to reducing carbon emissions as they saw fit. And at the time, everybody knew we had to ratchet up ambitions. I don't know how many times I've heard that phrase, ratcheting up ambitions. Well, now, post COP 29, we're looking now at COP 30. The ratcheting up of ambitions has not happened. And in my perspective, COP 21 was the last COP I was at. I haven't been to any since. But from people that I've talked to that have been there and my own research, the past few COPs especially, what has happened is the fossil fuel interests have gotten their hands in there. Like, fossil fuel energy companies need to have a seat at the table, of course, because we're talking about an energy transition. What my fear is that it's become more of a trade show for fossil fuels than actual substantive discussions about how we can address climate change and reduce carbon emissions. So my take post COP 29 is, my fear is that the COP process has gone a bit off the rails. And that, I mean, at COP 30 of these, and look where we are. We're not anywhere near as far as ambitious as we need to be. So I hate to be pessimistic about the COP process, but right now I am, frankly.
In reality, what causes this pessimism, if indeed it is? I don't think it's a pessimism. It's the realization that once there is too much conversation and less action, when
Mm.
there is more talk
Yeah.
and there is
Yes.
less action over 10 years, then naturally it's not working.
Yes.
So highlighting that there has been 10 years of conversations and no action taken, which I appreciate, for some may say is pessimism, but no, it's actually showing that no action has been taken and action has to be taken. And so I thought I would clarify that it's not pessimism, but it's
Okay.
more
Yeah.
highlighting the fact that we've had the ideas for 10 years. There is more that needs to be done. Sorry, I don't know if you wanted to do a follow up on that.
No, I appreciate that. I don't want to come off as like I was just saying before. Hope is when we stop fooling ourselves. So I think to be hopeful about the COP process, we can't fool ourselves that it's working right now, because it isn't. So,
Mm.
and that's realism. That's not pessimism. That's just realism. So, yeah, there's a good distinction there. I'm glad you brought that up. There's a good distinction between pessimism and realism. And I think that that's an important narrative aspect to keep in mind, that being realistic isn't being pessimistic. And then what maybe in a way it's more optimism because you're still fighting for something that you know it's not working. I think pessimism would be when, okay, screw it, it's not working, I give up. That's pessimism. Whereas, it's not working, let's make this work. That's more realism. So yeah, thanks for that clarification. That's good.
That's all right. Yeah. So you said we must maintain distance from the bad news. How do you stay hopeful, which is more like a follow up on what we've just mentioned? How do
Yeah.
we stay hopeful without becoming naive?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's just not always easy. I'll have to tell you. I mean, somebody that does what I do, so I'm immersed in all that's happening in this climate and environment and government now, governance being in the United States. And I will catch myself falling into some sort of a funk, as we say. For me, what I do is conversations like this always help me. I am helping a young man from Nigeria who's attending college and he wants to be an environmental advocate, and working with a young person like that, especially in a part of the world that I'm completely unfamiliar with, and seeing how he maintains a very energetic, positive attitude, and he lives in a world that's not as comfortable as mine. So that gives me, a reason to be positive, that there's young people living in more difficult parts of the world than where I am. So if he can maintain positivity, so can I. But even more personal, I'm very fortunate that I live in a very beautiful part of the world, Monterey Bay Area, in California. If anyone wants to look that up and pull some pictures off the internet, it's beautiful here. So I'm very fortunate in that I can just go out and enjoy the natural environment. But I think that's an important message for anybody, even if they're not where I am, to even if it's a simple thing like going out for a walk in the natural, in the outdoors. I think staying connected with nature is a very important part just to stay hopeful in the face of what all the climate change and all this, but also just to maintain a good emotional and mental balance. So I think reaching out, having conversations with people, and taking care of yourself, really, it's going to sound a little, I don't know how it's going to, getting a good night's sleep, eating well, just taking care of yourself. That really has helped me because there was a period in my life where I didn't necessarily take care of myself that well. And it just made anything I was trying to do so much more difficult. I mean, I didn't sleep well, maybe didn't get enough exercise or whatever. But now that I'm more conscious of that, I am much better able physically, emotionally, mentally to confront these enormous challenges that we all face.
Exploration on that beauty in nature, but what role does that beauty in nature and area play in engaging people on climate and biodiversity issues?
Well, I think maybe that staying personally connected with nature, even in a small sense, it doesn't mean we have to be out in the wilderness, but just staying somehow grounded in the natural environment, um, helps us mentally to get beyond these facts and figures that we can communicators like me can get drowned in the 1.5s, for instance. That if you stay connected with nature and stay grounded personally, then you can reach out to other people in a more human relatedness way, as opposed to just, instead of talking at people, you start to talk with people, and you listen to them. Listening is a big important thing. Even if you don't like what you're hearing, at least you know where they're coming from, and then you can maybe find a way into their consciousness that they might actually listen to you back. That's one thing I mentioned before, that all my pet trolls, I call them, the people that just like to harangue me on my website. Back in the day, I would try to, we were just talking at each other. And absolutely pointless. I mean, they weren't going to listen to me. I wasn't listening to them. It's just a waste of energy. So if you and those people you probably aren't going to find a way in, but there are people that might push back a little bit, but if you find out where they're coming from, and there are I can think I'm all righteous and I have all the right answers, but I don't. There might be somebody might bring something up that counters my worldview, and I go, well, you know what? There might be I don't know if I agree with this, but he might have a point. Maybe I can look into this a little bit more. Those sorts of conversations, that's where you can make some progress. Fortunately, there's not a whole lot of that happening right now. At least, I'm clouded right now because I am in the I'm in America under Trump 2.0, and so we're going through all that, and so that's kind of jarring to see what's happening in my country right now. And that's one of the big problems with what's happening in my country and probably in a lot of other places. We're all just kind of yelling at each other and nobody's listening. And so no progress is being made on so many different issues. But unfortunately, on climate change. Now, I do want to give a shout out to the subnational efforts on climate change. At the federal level, there's not going to be much happening in climate action for the next 4 years at least. But at the municipal, city, and state level, there are people that are engaged and on both ends of the political spectrum. Had several conversations with the mayor of Carmel, Indiana. He's a Republican, but he's very much interested in doing what he can to make his city more climate responsive. So, there are those instances, and I think if we can foster those sorts of communications, we can actually make progress instead of just talking at each other. Talk with people.
That's a very good tip about how to communicate from sustainability leaders to the key stakeholders. Are there any other tips you have for communicating clearly to stakeholders or audiences who are overwhelmed or skeptical and against the backdrop, as you mentioned, due to the current Trump 2.0, clearly there may be the perception that, but it's nice you've already shown that underneath the bigger government, the local level governments or community are more involved. But I'm curious to know if you have any tips around how sound or storytelling formats. I know we talk about storytelling, but now looking at the formats or the multimedia that play into reaching the wider audience that they can assimilate that information to make it less fact based
Yeah,
uh,
yeah.
messaging.
What's interesting is, as I've mentioned a couple times, I was trained as a musician and a sound engineer, so I'm into sound. I'm into the power of sound. And one of the things I've been trying to do with my podcast, my relatively new podcast, is incorporating in my storytelling. First of all, I try to incorporate storytelling elements. And in incorporating sound, I think people respond to sound. Obviously, music is the universal language, as people say. Uh, and that sounds kind of odd for me as a way to talk about climate change. But I think the arts, music, photography, that can appeal to people's emotions, and maybe that can soften people's, skepticism or open them up to new ideas. So I guess what I would say is just be creative. Find for me, like I mentioned, I'm into music and sound, so I that inspires me to create the stories that I tell, and I incorporate those aspects of it. But it might be something else. It might be writing fiction. It might be photography. It could be any number of things. And I do believe that that's a very important aspect of storytelling. Storytelling is how we can bring people together to make a substantive change.
What's your final thoughts to the listeners that you want to leave with them?
Well, I think that these are challenging times, but these are also exciting times. And hope isn't when we stop fooling ourselves, but we should never give up hope and go out for a walk, enjoy the sunshine, listen to the birds sing, connect with nature, and connect with your community.
A huge thank you to Thomas Schueneman for such a great insight, storytelling, climate change, from knowing about your story from the present.
Thank you. It's been a great conversation. I enjoyed
All
this.
right.